Friends, it is absolutely fabulous to be with you today. And we're going to go ahead and jump in and get started. It's been a couple weeks since I've been with you. I've missed you. I want to welcome you to our 134th online gathering for congregational leaders across the country. Friends, it was almost, Jason and I were just talking about it years ago to the day that we had our very first, and then it was called Being Church, but our very first gathering to support leaders as we were trying to figure out what was going on with COVID and how we were going to take faithful steps forward. And so since then, this weekly gathering has evolved, and it's now called Courageous Leadership. It is sponsored by ELCA's coaching ministry. I am Jill Beverlin. My pronouns are she, her. I am the program manager for coaching and one of your facilitators today. As part of my traditional land acknowledgement, I would like you to know that my home is located on the Fox River in Appleton, Wisconsin. This area is the ancestral territory of 5 nations of Native Indigenous peoples: the Menominee tribe, the Ho-Chunk-Winnebago tribe, the Potawatomi tribe, the Oneida tribe, and the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans and the Brothertown community. I honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this territory on which I live. As we step into our time today, friends, I encourage us to remember that we are seeking to create a safer and braver space in these gatherings for you to bring the truth of who you are and how you are doing. These conversations are meant to be an intentional step to live more fully into God's dream for us as the body of Christ. And again, welcome. I hope that you are doing well on your Lenten journeys, and happy early St. Patrick's Day. I am thrilled to have my friend and colleague, Pastor Tim Brown, with us today. Tim serves as the Director of Congregational Stewardship for the ELCA. He is also a fellow coach, a writer, a husband, a dad, a runner, and not necessarily in that order, of course. And he is kind of known for his wacky coffee mugs. And I personally believe that he also has great taste in music. Tim is one that models generosity and what it looks like to let the gifts God has given flow through us to be a blessing to others. Tim, one of the things that I personally appreciate most about you is how generous you are in sharing your gift of writing. The daily posts that you create about the saints of the church help ground me and keep me focused on where Jesus is asking me to serve each day. And so with that, friend, I want to welcome you to our space. We're anxious to learn from you about generosity.
Well, thanks, Jill, and deep love for you and also for Jason, and thank you for the invitation. And good to be here on the call, and yeah, on the saint day of Saint Louise de Marillac, who, if you're not familiar with Saint Louise, was kind of the yin to Saint Vincent de Paul's yang, and started a social network in France that not many people know about. If you are interested in the saints of the church, I do post on saints and then what I would consider would-be saints, like, for instance, Saint Freddie of the Mercuries, whose saint day is in August. You can follow me on Facebook or my blog, which is reluctantchristian.com, where I talk about these things. I want to go where you want to go today. And so I am happy to talk a little bit about generosity. As the Director of Congregational Stewardship for the ELCA, generosity, as it comes across through finances, is kind of my bailiwick. Talking with congregations and community leaders and pastors on the ins and outs of raising money to fuel mission. But I also do different types of generosity as well through my office. So I do generosity of voice, which is advocacy. I do stewardship of land, which we have the land acknowledgement at the beginning of this, but also encouraging congregations to think honestly about how they use their land and why they would use their land for different community groups, or buildings. Sometimes stewardship of land also comes across through holy closure. and talking with congregations about how they can be a continual blessing to others through different allocation of space usage and giving up their space. Yes, and land back conversations through Holy Closure as well. That's part of the mandate for the churchwide assembly that we had here. Yeah, and just a moment on Holy Closure. I know folks in these conversations can tend toward the sad or the morose through Holy Closure. But I just really want to remind you that none of the churches that Paul started are continually operating, right? At least not through their buildings. And none of us seem to be particularly disturbed about that. This is the cycle that we have: life, death, and resurrection. We talk about it every Sunday, and yet somehow we forget that it applies to every facet of our lives. From the daffodils that are starting to peek out in my lawn right now, despite the cold weather, to our organizations, including our churches. So life, death, and resurrection continues through all these ways, and that's part of what I talk about with generosity. So on the call right now, I'm just curious, and you can either put it in the chat or you can be brave and take yourself off of mute. What would be most life-giving for you to talk about today? I can talk a little bit about sharing gifts through writing. I can talk about kind of what I do with congregations approaching finances and talking about finances and kind of really difficult times. We don't mention the R word because we don't know that we're there. That's the recession word. But it is kind of financially fraught in a lot of corners. And so how do we talk about those things? And I can certainly talk about any of the other parts of generosity today too, but I want to go where you want to go. What would be the most helpful to you? You can put it in the chat, or you can put it, or you can come off mute and be brave and speak into the room.
First of all, Tim, I want to say hi. It's good to see you again.
Hi, Gwen. It's so good to see you.
Yes. And thank you for this topic because, as a church, sometimes we don't like to talk about, money or giving and things of that nature, which is odd to me, but that's another conversation. But what I'm really curious about, because I'm back home in Michigan, and I'm not going to talk too long, but the congregation that I'm at, my colleague was given a vision to share his space, which is great. However, he still is doing worship mainly online. People have not come back. And I don't really hear him. I mean, he'll say when it's time for the offering, you can go to our website. And I know when I was at New Covenant and we were online, I still would encourage people to actually give. I would say, we need your offering. You need to continue to support the ministry. So if you could talk a little bit about that, how to encourage people who aren't worshiping, in person, but they still need to support the church.
Yeah, thanks, Pastor. And great to see you too, by the way. Pastor Gwen and I were in a year-long cohort where we were talking about all things coaching, and she's a great partner, and thank you very much. I think the best way to address this might be through a story. And it's a short story, and it's one that came out of my practical ministry. Before I was the director of congregational stewardship here at the ELCA, I was a parish pastor. And so I had a parish in downtown Chicago, and I was there for 6 years, almost 7. And then I had a parish here as a senior pastor of a really large church in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I live right now. When I came to the church here in Raleigh, North Carolina, I inherited a budget that had more zeros than I'd ever seen in my life. And I wasn't sure how to handle that and what to do with it. And so I had to learn some different tactics and techniques to talk about stewardship in a way that was not just geared toward the what I would call the nuts and bolts, right? We need a new heater, but was actually going to empower people to be generous, because generosity spurs on more generosity. And so if you can talk about stories of generosity, you will spur on more generosity. So let me tell you one of the things that I did. And it took me 2 years to figure out how to do this and why, and I don't know why it took so long. But you know that part in the service where you'd pass the piece and there was kind of that lull, and then the ushers were going to come forward and you'd pass around the offering plates, right? And the choir had a really cool anthem, or the organist had, or the choir director had figured out some sort of musical piece they were going to do there. And all I did was tell our choir director and organist, I was like, give me 30 seconds. That's all I want in this space. So the ushers would come forward, they'd grab the offering plates, and I would say, you know, I just want you to know that this week, somebody came to the door and they couldn't pay their electric bill. And because of what you're doing right now, we were able to help them. Or another week, I would say, you know, we're gearing up to send 15 youth to the youth gathering this summer. And it's really exciting. They're very excited about it. And what's going on right now is going to help get them there so that they can have their lives changed and then go change lives. And it literally took exactly that long. That's all I would say. And you know what happened? People responded in real time to what was going on because they understood that their action that they were doing right then had long-lasting consequences. So instead of the offering becoming a rote action, it became a meaning-making endeavor. And so, Pastor Gwen, that's what I would encourage the pastor you're talking about, or encourage any pastor right now. Don't miss the opportunity. The offering can be a high point of ministry, not a low point of obligation. And that can happen just through telling the story of what you're going to do with that. And before you say, yeah, but you know what, Tim, most of our offering goes to paying the electric bill of our own church, right? Before you say that, think of what the community around your church or your congregation would say if your congregation was gone tomorrow. What would they say is missing? Because I bet they'd say something like, well, that safe place where our kids could play basketball is missing, or the women and children in crisis shelter that happens there every month would be missing. Or they would say that the feeding program that is done out of there on Saturdays would be missing. Or they'd say, you know, we have a Southern Baptist church down the road and we have a fundamentalist church down the road, and there's not a safe place for our queer kids if this church was missing. So you're not going to pay the electric bill. What you're doing is creating a mission outpost for the work that Jesus Christ has called you to do, and you're sustaining it. That's what you're doing, right? You're not paying the electric bill. I mean, when we start to reframe what we're doing in terms of the missional lens rather than the nuts and bolts lens, that unleashes generosity, because you're talking about lives change and impact instead of status quo. Nobody is interested in the status quo. I'm not interested in the status quo. But the work that you are doing is not the status quo. And if you think it is the status quo, then it's time to reevaluate what you're doing. And that's an honest conversation to have too. We got some questions in the chat here. I'm gonna go ahead and start answering some of that, if that's okay. Pastor Gwen, thumbs up. Did that give you some thoughts there?
Excellent, excellent. Okay. Thank you.
Cool. Our friend Andrea asks about generosity, money practices in different generations. This is really really fascinating right now. One of the things that I want to tell you, and I tell you this as a point of inspiration. Everybody talks about the church attendance being in decline. And I'm sorry, my cat is going to come right in front of the camera in just 2 seconds. I'm just going to let you know. This is Runtelstiltskin, and he's a problem when I'm on Zoom. So, so they talk about, there he is. They talk about church attendance being in decline. And that is true. We can see that. Although I would caveat that by saying in-person church attendance tends to be inclined. Virtual church attendance is skyrocketing at the moment. And when we say that in-person is better than virtual, we're not taking into account the fact that we can do something like this and it be meaningful, right? This is meaningful. So it's not good to pit them against each other. But even though church attendance in general is in decline, actually gifts to church are steady. and this is especially true in the ELCA, which means that even though we have fewer people, they're being more generous. That is a story to tell. People are being more generous in these days than they used to be. And one of the reasons they're being more generous is because we're getting better at storytelling, even within the congregational context. And so when we have different generations, like my parents' generation, they're at the early end of the boomers, and their parents' generation, a lot of them gave out of obligation. This was a social contract. This is what you did. And you gave to certain things because that's just what you did. My generation, I'm the early millennial, and then my children's generation, they're going to give because they've been taught to give. This is a generational switch that's happened here. You know, my parents and their parents, they gave because it was a social contract. They gave because that's what you did. But generosity is actually a taught behavior. And so I'm generous because I was taught to be generous. My kids will be generous because they're taught to be generous. And what we're finding is actually millennials and Gen Zs are more generous than their parents were and their grandparents were, because they see it as opportunity instead of obligation. But the thing is, they only want to give to things that are going to change people's lives. They don't want to give to things that keep up status quo, because they don't see the benefit of status quo. And just practically, one of the reasons they don't see the benefit of status quo is because, well, they're going to pay more for college and get less income than their parents or grandparents did. And so they're like, the systems that we had propped up aren't working for us, so why would we do that? Why would we give to that? But they will give to changing lives. So if you talk about it in the lens of changing lives, that's how you talk to generations on all sides. When you speak about changing lives, all generations respond. All generations respond. This is one of the reasons we don't talk about tithing much anymore. Tithing doesn't mean a whole lot to folks anymore. And to me, tithing is actually the least generous thing that you can do. And I'll just explain it really quickly. If you give me something and you say you have to use this on Tuesdays, then I'm probably going to use it only on Tuesdays. I'm going to do the bare minimum to meet the requirement. But if you give me something and you say, you know what, unleash this to the world, you can use it in any way you want, I'm going to be more apt to use it on Wednesdays and Thursdays and Fridays as well, because you're giving it to me as gift and there's no obligation to it, which means I can use it all. If we think about the things that God has given us as gift instead of a tithe or even entrusted to us as a gift to us, we can use it in all sorts of cool and honest and wonderful ways, and we don't have to meet a minimum. Andrea, was that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Like your books. We have a book affinity.
Thank you.
Elise, approaching congregational finances, instability, and helping lead the congregation beyond a Band-Aid fix to consider where the congregation might be moving. Yeah, we have a lot of fear moving in the world right now. And I talk about the difference between sufficiency and scarcity a lot. One of the phrases that I use with congregations a lot, and I use it with congregational leaders too, is you can starve in a pantry if you just look at the floor. And I know that sounds like a trite moralism or something like that, but it is a total reframing. Looking around you to see what's there, being reminded that fear doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell the whole truth. And that's the problem with fear. It tells you just enough truth for you to believe it. So nod to fear, acknowledge it, listen to it, and then turn and look in a new direction. Look around the pantry around you. Yeah, fear says you're starving. And it's true, I'm hungry. But you have things around you that you can use. And one of the reasons that God calls us into community is so that we can rely on each other, especially in those difficult times. And if you can remind a congregation that, yeah, people are afraid, finances or even the society around us were afraid, but that's why we're together. That's why we're doing things together. so that we can be together and help each other through this and share what we have with one another. That's the call. The call is for us to share what we have with one another. It's one of the reasons I encourage pastors to be honest about their gifts and how they're sharing them with the congregation, even financial gifts. I mean, it was always free to know when I was a parish pastor how much I was giving to the church, because I thought it was important for them to see what I was giving and know what I'm giving. It's a part of our spiritual lives, and it helped them to not be as afraid to be honest and to give and to stretch a little bit too, because they also saw what they were paying me and they knew I was giving quite a bit more in proportion than what they were paying, and it made them less afraid to give too, because we were all banking on each other and off of faith. Our friend John Otto talks about some talk around advocacy and the need to address the ongoing affair of the country to, and I'm sorry, John, I can't read it there, but meet the basic needs of its population. Yeah, well, first of all, a lot of congregations don't even know we have an advocacy office in the ELCA. And even just highlighting that can be, I think, really helpful in reminding people that the ELCA has folks on the ground who are trying to work within the power structures that we are given, even as we dream about powers outside of those structures, right? And talking honestly about that. One of the things I talk with congregations about sometimes when they get worried about these sorts of things is that we can be political without being partisan. I'm not interested in what's next to your voting card, a D or an R or an L or whatever, right? What I am interested is that when we check boxes, we do it to the best of our ability, that it matches our values. And we can certainly talk about our values. And we should be able to talk openly and honestly about our values. And we can talk honestly and openly about how the way the government operates does not often meet our values. And yet we have to work within these structures, because it is through these structures that, and even despite these structures, that we reach up and bend the moral arc. And that's why working with the advocacy office of the ELCA and having a voice even there is really important. And if you see a need in your community, pray honestly. Maybe that's someplace where the congregation can live into a different reality for the people there. And how can we do that? How can we meet that? Friend John, we are considering how helping people remain generous as we prepare to pay off the mortgage on our building. Addition, but still experience a shortage of people and funds, living abundance in the midst of scarcity. Yeah. One of the things, though, that I remind folks, John, is that it's never an either or situation when it comes to Lutherans. It's always a both and. And if you are trying to pay off debt, you also can do other things. If you are paying off a mortgage, you can also do other things. You can do a capital campaign and meet your regular expenses. It's both and. We can do both of these things. And generosity leads to generosity. So talking about one is a funnel to talking about the other. You don't have to choose between those things. What you do need to do is capture the stories of how those things are changing the lives. For instance, if you pay off that mortgage, right? Have a plan for whatever that mortgage. In my parish here in Chicago, or in Raleigh, we were paying $17,000 a month on our mortgage. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? Crazy. I said, let's pay this off early. And when we pay it off early, this is where that $17,000 is going to go. And we talked about the different places we were going to chop that up. And that motivated people to pay it off early so that we could free up that giving to do something else with it. That's the story. That's what you do. You tell how you're going to use it. And so if you're trying to pay off the mortgage, talk up how you're going to use that mortgage payment to do other things. And people are like, well, we should put it away for a rainy day. And you can remind them it's raining somewhere all the time. We can be a blessing, right? The highest percentage of giving that took place was during the Depression. Yeah. people continue to give, thus raising the percentage. Yeah, John. I haven't heard that specific one, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, in 2020 and 2021, nonprofits had the best year they've had in 40 years because people were feeling scarcity and they responded, and they knew that people were hurting and that they were dying. I mean, that would not surprise me to be true. The thing is, people will only give in moments of crisis for a little while, because no one can live in crisis forever. So what we need to do is, instead of talking about life as being crisis, or even the church as being crisis, or it's why in the middle of June, you don't say, hey, we are behind $50,000 on our offering. Well, guess what? Every nonprofit is behind $50,000 on their operating expense in June. Do you want to know why? Because 90% of nonprofits get 20% of their income in December. 90% of nonprofits get 20% of their income in December, which means in June, everybody's suffering. So you don't say, hey, the Titanic is sinking in June, because everybody's Titanic is sinking then. Instead, what you do is you tell stories of generosity. You tell stories where things are going awesome. They're going great. And that's actually how you get people to respond in June. So it wouldn't surprise me that the Depression showed increased giving. The thing is, it can't always be Depression time. So we have to figure out different stories to tell at different times in our lives. Do you recommend using a narrative budget as a way of showing where resources are given? Yes, absolutely. Narrative budgets are great. In fact, if you aren't in the habit of doing a narrative budget, this is something that I can offer a webinar on, and we can do that even in this space if we want to, on narrative budgets and how to do that. Or if you want to talk to your synod, I work with the bishops and the DEMs in every synod. Say, hey, we'd love Tim in the stewardship office to do a webinar on narrative budgets, how to create them, what they would be for, giving you some examples of narrative budgets. I can do that. Narrative budgets tell the story behind the numbers. And well, like I was just saying, right? You have your electric bill, but your electric bill is actually not your electric bill. Your electric bill for your congregation is actually how we keep the heat on for the women and children who use it as a shelter on Tuesday nights, right? That's your electric bill. Or, you know, any of those other things I was saying. So it translates what you're doing into life-changing moments. Thanks, Joe. John Otto, examples of how ELCA congregations have become more effective in their mission by cooperating with neighboring congregations with whom we are in full communion. I mean, this is happening all over the place. We have one here in North Carolina where I live, where Episcopal and Lutheran congregation have come together to start a Spanish-speaking ministry. And in fact, now it's all Spanish, and the Anglo community has moved to a different location because the Spanish-speaking community became so big. We have this happening all the time. I would imagine that you don't have to look far, even within your Senate, to find out or to find these things are going on. The thing here, and this is the thing that I would encourage you, if you're thinking about neighboring with another congregation, even a full communion partner congregation, one of the things that you have to talk with your community about, and I think talk with your own spirit about, is what am I willing to let go of to do this partnership, this new thing? You know, what am I willing to let go of? How are we willing to let go? In 2 weeks, we have the story of Lazarus coming up in the lectionary, and it's a great story. It's one of my favorites, and you know, it's the prelude to Jesus's own resurrection. But one of the things I wonder about with that story, with Lazarus and with Martha and Mary, is, you know, having been through death, Lazarus probably emerged from that tomb very different as a person than he went into it. Having been through that experience, he was probably really different. And Mary and Martha probably had to adjust to a new person, a new brother, after that experience. And were they willing to do that, to have new life? I just wonder that conversation. because I see this with congregations all over the place. St. John's by the gas pump is merging with St. Mark's by the cistern. And for a little while, there are St. John's and St. Mark's with a dash between them because neither one of them are willing to give up their name. But something is different about them having been through that experience. And are they willing to be with that new thing? Or is it better that it die and somehow life goes on in other ways? That's something that congregations really need to wrestle with. And I think that leaders need to wrestle with and congregation members need to wrestle with. But see, here's the thing. We wrestle with this stuff all the time and we just don't realize it. We're looking at redoing or painting our back deck. I know this is ridiculous, but my kids, my boys are concerned about, what color will we paint it because they'll look at the house differently. Like, yeah, you're going to look at your home differently. It's going to be different. Different's okay, or should we just not get it painted and then have it the way it is? It's not going to work. Yeah. There are different ways that we can reframe everything in our life to see, I think, what God is doing in that moment. And in the congregation, it has to come through the lens of life change. And I think if we're looking to the future and we're looking at churches merging and consolidating, it needs to look through the lens of life change too, and being okay with all aspects of that as it comes about, even the difficult parts, but then also looking to the joyous parts of what that might mean. You might be encouraged also to know this last little statistic, and then we can see where we want to go from here. Attendance right now is proportionally about what it was in the 1920s in America. People think that the 1900s, early 1900s, everybody and their mother was going to church. It's just not true. It was factionalized then. Protestants and Catholics were at their worst with each other, especially in the American context. And congregational attendance was pretty dismal, pretty low from what they experienced in the 1950s. What happened in the 1950s for it to skyrocket? Anybody know?
Baby boom.
Red Scare.
What's that, Mark?
The Red Scare, that atheism was considered kind of taboo, and so you better get yourself into church.
Sure. I think Sylvia and Mark are not far off of it, but there was actually one event that happened right before all of that changed everything. Anyway, it was World War II. And after the success of World War II, as if we can ever say war is a success, right? But after World War II, in the United States declared victory, religion and the civic duty held hands, and they joined hands, and they stopped being critical of one another in important ways that came out sideways during the Civil Rights Movement, when the church should have been able to be more critical, but was not able to be because they were, taking tax benefits off of the government. The government said, "We'll put "In God We Trust" on our money if you stop, talking too much about some of the things that really bother us." And we agreed. We did that. And church attendance boomed, partly because also of atheism and Red Scare and communism as a red herring that was going on all the time, right? And partly because people were having babies. And you know what happened when people started having babies? We had to have a Sunday school. Sunday school was basically the church's answer to civic problem. And what was that civic problem? Kids had nowhere to go on Sunday mornings. They were in school the rest of the time, and they had nowhere to go on Sunday mornings. And so they started Sunday school organizations so that kids would have someplace to go on Sunday mornings. I kid you not. This was a civic endeavor. People thought it was about indoctrinating children in the faith. It was largely about keeping them occupied on Sunday mornings. It turned into something, but that's what it was. So church attendance, even though people say, yeah, it's falling, it's falling, it's falling. My question to that is, compared to what? Compared to 1955, yes. Compared to 1915, not really. We have to be able to ride the waves of all these things in our lives. John asks a good question. How is the ELCA helping congregations enable their members to differentiate between Christianity and Americanism? You know, John, I hope we're doing that, and I hope we're doing that in many and various ways. I mean, the ELCA Advocacy Office, but then also I think I've seen this even recently with things going on. I mean, when Iowa passed these laws, these anti-trans laws that were coming out, bishops in Iowa spoke out forcefully. It was even on some of their web pages against this. We're not just going with the status quo. We're not just going with the flow. The thing about that question that's difficult, though, is that's going to mean, I mean, the proof there is going to mean something different to everybody, depending on who you're asking. I think we need to talk more and more about how nationalism is actually a sinful posture, especially if we talk about Jesus, who, well, I mean, we have the readings right now in Lent with the woman at the well, right? That's a repudiation of nationalism. Jesus conversing with a Samaritan. Yeah. How can we use those moments to talk honestly about those things? And interestingly enough, this is one of the places that we agree with the LCMS on. You know, LCMS has also said that Christian nationalism is a sin, and Harrison even asked for excommunication for those folks, which I thought was really fascinating. Jill, I saw you come off mute. Did you have a thought there?
Oh, I have all kinds of thoughts. This is just such a wonderfully rich conversation. And one of the things that I want to highlight for those of us in the room and those of us that will hear the recording later is the importance of story. If you'll notice, there's almost nothing that Tim responds to without some sort of narrative. And Tim, you and I are connected with the project through the innovation team at the church-wide office, where we heard a story of a congregation. And I don't know if you remember this from when we were in Minneapolis with these leaders. There was a congregation, friends, that realized we're being forced to close. They didn't have enough resource to keep going forward. But they said, you know what? If we're going to close, we're going to go out loving the community around us. So they started pooling what they had and asked the community what they needed most and started leaning into those needs. And pretty soon, the story of what they were doing started to gain traction in their community. And people from outside the church walls started bringing them things because they said, hey, you know what? And I wish I could remember the name of the congregation. Do you remember the name, Tim?
No, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Right. And so the community started bringing them stuff. And soon they realized we have so much stuff. We can't close the doors because people keep bringing us stuff. And they're still here today because it really was as simple as we're choosing to love the people around us in the best way that we know how. And friends, there's not a story in the Bible where Jesus calls us to something and doesn't also resource us. And I think that one of our tripping points is that we have blinders on when we look at the resources around us, including the people that are in our community and what our community and the resources within our faith community can be. I think we have to start looking with fresh eyes, new eyes, and imagine what can be. And that's one of the spaces that coaching can come into and help us take this gem and turn it ever so slightly. And suddenly the light reflects off of it in a different way and we see it completely differently.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that, Joe. Yeah. I mean, the truth is we're in a pantry. And so there are resources all around. We just we just need to be encouraged to look up instead of down, or empowered even to look up instead of down.
So friends, you have brought some great questions to the table. I'm wondering if you would like to spend 10 minutes in a breakout room to unpack together. And Tim, if you had a couple of starter questions that you could send into the breakout rooms, and then we can come back at 5 till the hour and raise up final learnings and have a final blessing. How does that feel as a trajectory?
Sure. Jill, would you like me to put the questions in the chat, or would you like me to just speak them aloud?
Both, please.
Okay. Well, I'll speak them aloud first, but I would say one of the things I would lift up is how is your community changing lives right now? Tell the story. We have to be proficient storytellers about these things. How is your community changing lives right now? Another question I would say is, or ask is, how do you see your work in particular as being life-changing? And if you're not currently in a community or in under call or something like that, that doesn't matter, right? We are all doing some sort of work that God is calling us to do. How is that changing lives right now?
Welcome back to this space, friends. So as is our habit, I would love to hear what learnings or themes have bubbled up for you, or what additional questions might you have for our guest speaker today. And also remembering that we're keeping the confidence of our small group buddies. And so who's first to share?
Well, I'll start, Jill.
Thank you, Pastor Gwen. I can always count on you.
Well, basically, the group that I was in, everyone had just wonderful missions that they were doing in their communities that was really making a change. It was just really wonderful to hear that the church is not stagnant. There's a lot of good mission work that's being done, and that was just so refreshing to hear.
The church isn't dying, right, Pastor Gwen?
Not at all. There's a lot of new life in us. So yes, living water. Yes, very much, very much. Mm-hmm.
Amen. All the symbolism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So who's next?
I'll go.
Thank you, Mark.
I guess I think the challenge is that sometimes we think too much in like groupthink or generalities, and a challenge for us to think about specific stories in a congregation and not just kind of general stuff, but also like individuals in the congregation. Do individuals have stories about how their faith is changing people's lives? And I think that's the challenge is not being okay with generalities, but helping us be observe things and have specific stories that are impacting.
Absolutely. And that's powerful, Mark, on a lot of levels. It's helping, it's from a faith formation lens, right? It's helping our people learn how to share. This is the difference that having faith in Jesus Christ has made in my life, and the impact that it's having. And what does it look like when we move from a pastor-centric posture to empowering the lay leadership in our faith communities? And I think that that's the next treasure chest that we're opening in the ELCA, is recognizing that and helping our lay leaders name that. Carol, please.
And thank you for that cue, because many of our lay leaders are coaches, or many of our coaches are lay leaders. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that for that second question, how do you see your work being life-changing? Every time I coach, I have an opportunity to experience that. And I get to support the people, especially clergy, who are supporting others, and make sure that they get what they need to be healthy and have good boundaries, and have that safe space to be recognized and heard. And I'm so gratified that I get to do that.
It is sacred space, isn't it, Carol? Amen. Amen. Friends, how about one more short story?
I'd like to share.
Thank you, Persida.
You know that I was looking for a church home, and I finally found a church home. It's St. Philip's Lutheran Church in Myrtle Beach. It's a church that is welcoming of all people, and they're having a capital campaign, so they have a lot of stories, Timothy, to talk about. And one of the stories that I read in the campaign was this young woman, who's a lesbian. She was looking for a church home as well. And she said she passed by the church and she saw the rainbow flag on the office window of the pastor. And then she said, I was feeling the need to go to worship, but I couldn't find a church that would accept me. And I saw that flag and I felt like this is a place that I would be welcome. And I enjoyed so much reading that story because I too was looking for a home. And now I'm going to be a member at the end of the month. So I'm excited that I'm going to be a member of this dynamic church that is growing. It's got children. They last week they gave 14 Bibles out to 14 young kids, and it's going. And their capital campaign is going because they're outgrowing their building. So the church isn't closing, ladies and gentlemen. It's growing, and I was so excited. And then one way that I feel that I can bring the gift of my Latino self is that I too want other Latinos to be part of this congregation. And how am I going to do that? Well, I'm meeting people on the streets and I say, what is it that you need? And everybody tells me, I want to learn English. So one of the things I'm going to do later on when I'm there a little bit, give them a chance to get to know me first, is, invite them to open themselves to be a church to offer English as a second language, So that's a way that I think I can help this congregation and the community to be more inclusive and more inviting. So I'm excited about that potential.
Persida, thank you for sharing that story and sharing your excitement with us. And friends, I hope that you hear in everything that's being shared today, especially what our guest and our beloved brother Tim has shared with us, the importance of understanding our purpose. That's something that Tim and Jason and I talked about over our time together. And so please continue to think about that. Think about how Spirit is stirring the naming of that in your space. Friends, thank you again for coming and joining today. I want you to know as you leave that you are seen, you are valued, and indeed you are loved. And I appreciate you so much. Come back next week. Our guest speaker will be talking to us about thriving, not after COVID, because we're not beyond COVID, but thriving in this new landscape that we're in since the time of COVID. And so that really does kind of partner up along with what Tim has shared with us. Tim, thank you again for the privilege it's been to learn from you. Friends, we will have Tim back. We already have a date for him to come and speak with us about narrative budget, but we hope to have him back at least once a quarter to learn, just to learn from this wise human that's in our midst. Okay, thank you, friends. God bless you.